Welcome to Drowsworthy, where history's most dangerous moments become your most peaceful sleep. Tonight, we're exploring the Great Molasses Flood of 1919, a disaster so catastrophically sweet that you definitely wouldn't survive it. But don't worry, the calm narration and gentle rain sounds will help you drift off while learning about how 2 million gallons of molasses, moving at 35 miles per hour, turned Boston's North End into a sticky graveyard. If you love falling asleep to history's darkest chapters, subscribe for weekly bedtime disasters. Feel free to turn the lights down, maybe put a fan on for that gentle hum. Get comfortable, because we're about to explore one of history's stickiest situations. Why you wouldn't last a day working near the molasses tank in 1919. Boston. Picture this. It's January 15th, 1919, and you're walking through Boston's North End at 12:30 in the afternoon. The air carries the usual industrial cocktail of coal smoke, horse manure, and something else, something sickeningly sweet that clings to the back of your throat. That's molasses, and if you lived or worked in this neighborhood, that smell was as much a part of your daily existence as the sound of trolley cars and the chatter of Italian immigrants who had made this corner of Boston their home. You wouldn't survive here, not because of the crushing poverty or the dangerous working conditions, though those would certainly test your limits. You wouldn't survive because you're about to witness something so unprecedented, so impossibly absurd, that no amount of modern safety knowledge could prepare you for it. You're about to experience what happens when industrial negligence meets the laws of physics in the most catastrophic way possible. Let's start your day as a worker in the North End. You wake up in a cramped tenement, probably sharing 2 rooms with 6 other family members. The walls are thin, the heat barely works, and the smell of yesterday's cabbage soup still hangs in the air. But you're lucky to have work, even if that work involves being within a few hundred yards of a 50-foot-tall steel tank, containing over 2 million gallons of molasses. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company tank loomed over the neighborhood like a rusty brown monument to industrial progress. Built in 1915. This massive container was supposed to hold molasses imported from the Caribbean, molasses that would be distilled into rum and industrial alcohol. But from the moment it was constructed, this tank was a disaster waiting to happen, and you, dear viewer, would have absolutely no idea just how close to death you were every single day. As you make your way to work, perhaps at the nearby firehouse, or the elevated railway office, or one of the many small businesses that dotted Commercial Street, you pass this tank dozens of times a week. You've grown accustomed to its presence, the way people grow accustomed to living next to active volcanoes or fault lines. The tank groans sometimes, especially when the weather changes, but industrial equipment makes noise. That's normal, right? Wrong. What you don't know is that this tank was built by a company more concerned with profit than public safety. The steel walls are too thin for the immense pressure they're supposed to contain. The construction was rushed, inspected poorly, and approved by officials who had no real understanding of the engineering challenges involved in storing such massive quantities of viscous liquid. If you worked directly for the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, your day would begin with the ritual of checking the tank's condition. You'd walk around its base, looking for obvious signs of damage, but you wouldn't know what to look for. The telltale signs of structural failure, the subtle buckling of metal under stress, the microscopic cracks that grow larger with each temperature change. These wouldn't be obvious to someone without advanced engineering knowledge. The molasses itself was another hazard you couldn't fully comprehend. This wasn't the molasses you might pour over pancakes. This was industrial grade, thick as tar in cold weather, caustic enough to burn exposed skin and heavy beyond your imagination. A gallon of molasses weighs about 11.5 pounds, which means that tank contained roughly 23 million pounds of liquid sweetness, pressing against those inadequate steel walls every moment of every day. On this particular January morning, the temperature was unusually warm for Boston in the middle of winter. The previous night had been cold, around 2 degrees Fahrenheit, but by noon the temperature had risen to over 40 degrees. You might enjoy this unseasonable warmth, shedding your heavy coat as you go about your business. But what you don't realize is that this temperature change is creating a perfect storm of physics inside that tank. Cold molasses is thick and sluggish, exerting relatively manageable pressure against the tank walls. But as the temperature rises, molasses becomes more fluid, more dynamic, and infinitely more dangerous. The warming liquid expands, increasing the pressure against walls that were already inadequate when the tank was built. Carbon dioxide, naturally present in the fermenting molasses, begins to come out of solution as the temperature rises, creating bubbles that increase the pressure even more. If you were working nearby around 10 in the morning, you might have heard the tank making unusual sounds. Local residents later reported hearing rumbling noises, like distant thunder, coming from the direction of the molasses tank. Some people noticed the tank walls bulging outward more than usual. A few particularly observant individuals even saw molasses seeping from the base of the tank, creating small puddles on the ground that quickly attracted swarms of flies. But you're not a structural engineer. You're just someone trying to make a living in an industrial neighborhood, where strange sounds and odd smells are part of the daily routine. The elevated railway trains rattle overhead every few minutes. Horse-drawn carts clatter over cobblestones, steam whistles blow at the nearby firehouse, and factory machinery hums and clanks throughout the day. One more unusual sound doesn't seem particularly alarming. Around noon, you might have noticed that children from the nearby school were playing in the area, as they often did during lunch break. The tank, despite its obvious dangers, had become a familiar part of the neighborhood landscape. Kids would sometimes collect molasses that seeped from the base, taking it home as a sweet treat. The idea that this massive container could fail catastrophically was simply beyond most people's imagination. The neighborhood itself was densely packed with wooden buildings, most of them built quickly and cheaply to house the waves of immigrants who had flooded into Boston in the previous decades. Italian families predominated, but there were also Irish, Jewish, and Eastern European residents, all crowded into tenements that had been thrown up with little regard for safety or building codes. If you were enjoying lunch at one of the small restaurants on Commercial Street, you might have been discussing the war, which had officially ended just 2 months earlier. Or perhaps the growing tensions between workers and management that were leading to strikes across the country. What you wouldn't be discussing was the possibility that industrial negligence could turn your peaceful lunch into a fight for survival. The streets around the tank were narrow and congested, typical of Boston's older neighborhoods. Commercial Street ran directly past the tank, with the elevated railway structure overhead creating a sort of tunnel effect that would soon trap the rushing molasses and direct it, with devastating force toward the buildings beyond. If you were walking along this street at the wrong moment, you would find yourself in the path of a 25-foot-high wave of molasses moving at 35 miles per hour. Your human reflexes, evolved over millions of years to help your ancestors escape from predators on the African savanna, would be utterly inadequate to deal with this threat. The molasses wave would be moving too fast to outrun, too high to jump over, and too wide to dodge. If you tried to run, your feet would slip on the molasses that was already spreading across the pavement. If you tried to take shelter in a nearby building, The wave would likely demolish the structure before you could reach safety. Let's pause here for a moment. If you're enjoying this peaceful journey through history's chaos, consider subscribing for more bedtime disasters. Now, let's get back to your final moments in 1919 Boston. The most terrifying aspect of your situation wouldn't be the speed of the disaster, but the nature of the substance that was about to engulf you. Molasses at 40 degrees Fahrenheit has the consistency of thick honey, but it's far more dangerous than it sounds. When 2 million gallons of this substance suddenly breaks free from its containment, it doesn't behave like water. It doesn't splash and then flow away. Instead, it grabs and holds whatever it touches. If the molasses wave caught you, it would immediately begin to harden as it lost heat to the cold air and the even colder ground. Within minutes, you would find yourself trapped in what was essentially edible quicksand. The molasses would seep into your clothing, your hair, your mouth and nose. Breathing would become increasingly difficult as the thick liquid coated your respiratory passages. The psychological horror of this situation cannot be overstated. Drowning in water is terrifying, but drowning in molasses adds layers of claustrophobia and helplessness that are almost incomprehensible. You would be able to see and hear rescuers just feet away, but the molasses would make movement almost impossible. Every struggle would exhaust you further while accomplishing virtually nothing. If you somehow managed to avoid the initial wave, your troubles would be far from over. The molasses would continue to spread, covering an area of several city blocks to a depth that varied from 2 to 15 feet. The streets would become impassable except for the hardiest rescue workers, and even they would need special equipment to navigate the sticky morass. The winter weather, which seemed like such a blessing earlier in the day, would now become another enemy. As the temperature dropped throughout the afternoon and evening, the molasses would continue to thicken and harden, making rescue efforts increasingly difficult. People trapped in upper floors of damaged buildings would have to wait hours or even days for help to reach them. Assuming the buildings remained structurally sound after being battered by the initial wave, your neighborhood would be transformed into an alien landscape. Familiar streets would disappear under a brown, sticky coating that reflected light in strange ways and created an almost supernatural silence. The usual sounds of urban life would be muffled by the thick layer of molasses, creating an eerie quiet broken only by the occasional crash of a building settling on its damaged foundation or the distant shouts of rescue workers. The cleanup would take weeks, and during that time, the neighborhood would remain largely uninhabitable. The molasses would attract every insect within miles, creating clouds of flies that would make the area almost unbearable. The smell, initially sweet, would gradually become sickening as the molasses began to ferment and rot, especially when mixed with sewage from broken pipes and organic matter from destroyed buildings. Even if you survived the initial disaster, the long-term health effects would likely shorten your life significantly. The molasses contained various industrial chemicals and impurities that would be harmful if inhaled or absorbed through the skin. The stress of surviving such a traumatic event, combined with the loss of home and livelihood that most survivors experienced, would take a toll that might not become apparent for years. Your chances of survival would depend largely on pure luck. Where exactly you happened to be standing at 12:30 p.m. on January 15th, 1919, a few feet in any direction could mean the difference between life and death, between becoming one of the 21 people who died that day or one of the hundreds who lived to tell the story of the day. Boston was consumed by sweetness, turned deadly. The most crushing realization, if you had survived long enough to have it, would be that this disaster was entirely preventable. The signs of impending failure had been visible for years to anyone who knew what to look for. The company had received complaints about the tank's condition, had even hired workers to paint over the rust and cracks to make them less obvious, but had never addressed the fundamental engineering flaws that made collapse inevitable. You wouldn't have survived not because you lacked courage or intelligence or physical strength, but because you were living in an era when industrial safety was an afterthought and corporate responsibility was a foreign concept. You would have been a victim of the same attitudes that filled the air with coal smoke, dumped industrial waste into rivers, and built tenements that were fire traps waiting for a spark. The economics of your situation would have made escape even more difficult. Most residents of the North End were recent immigrants working in low-paying jobs that required them to live within walking distance of their employment. You couldn't afford to live in the safer, more expensive neighborhoods on Beacon Hill or in Back Bay. You were economically trapped in the shadow of industrial hazards that wealthier Bostonians would never have tolerated in their own backyards. Your daily routine would have created a false sense of security about the tank's presence. Human psychology is remarkably adaptable when it comes to living with constant danger. Coal miners learn to ignore the ever-present risk of cave-ins and gas explosions. People living near active volcanoes go about their daily lives without constantly thinking about potential eruptions. Similarly, you would have developed what psychologists now call risk habituation, the mental process by which we unconsciously decide that dangers we encounter regularly without consequence must not be as dangerous as they appear. This psychological adaptation would have been your downfall. Each day you walked past the groaning, leaking tank without incident would have reinforced your unconscious belief that it was basically safe. The human brain is wired to focus on immediate, obvious threats while filtering out background dangers that don't seem pressing. A snarling dog gets your full attention, but a structurally unsound industrial tank becomes invisible through familiarity. The social dynamics of your neighborhood would have further complicated any potential response to warning signs. In a community where most residents spoke limited English and had little formal education, technical discussions about structural engineering and industrial safety would have been nearly impossible. Even if someone had tried to raise concerns about the tank, the language barriers and class differences between working-class immigrants and educated professionals would have made meaningful communication extremely difficult. Your work schedule would have placed you in maximum danger during the most hazardous time of day. The Molasses tank was most unstable during periods of rapid temperature change, particularly when warming weather caused the contents to expand and pressurize. Unfortunately, these temperature swings typically occurred during the midday hours when the neighborhood was most crowded with workers, shoppers, and school children. The industrial culture of 1919 Boston actively discouraged the kind of questioning that might have saved lives. Workers who raised safety concerns were often labeled as troublemakers and fired. Company managers prioritized production schedules and profit margins over employee welfare. Government inspectors were either incompetent, corrupt, or simply overwhelmed by the rapid pace of industrial development. In this environment, your natural survival instincts would have been systematically suppressed by economic necessity and social pressure. If you had been one of the few people with enough technical knowledge to recognize the signs of impending structural failure, speaking up would have required enormous personal courage. You would have been challenging not just one company, but an entire economic system built on the assumption that industrial progress justified almost any level of risk to working-class communities. As we prepare to explore the specific events of that January afternoon, remember that every person caught in this disaster was someone like you, a human being with hopes, fears, families, and dreams, going about their ordinary day in a neighborhood they thought they knew, unaware that industrial negligence was about to turn their familiar world into a nightmare of sticky, sweet death. The biography of disaster, Arthur Gell and the Day Boston Drowned in Sweetness. The story of the Great Molasses Flood cannot be told without examining the man whose negligence made it inevitable. Arthur P. Gell, treasurer of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. Gell was not a mustache-twirling villain from A Penny Dreadful, but something far more dangerous. A respectable businessman whose corner-cutting and willful blindness to safety concerns would ultimately cost 21 people their lives and transform a Boston neighborhood into a sticky graveyard. Arthur Gell embodied the industrial arrogance of the early 20th century, a time when American business leaders believed that rapid expansion and maximum profit justified almost any risk to public safety. Born into modest circumstances in the Midwest, Gell had clawed his way up through the ranks of various industrial enterprises, developing a reputation as someone who could get things done quickly and cheaply. By 1915, when his company decided to build the molasses storage tank in Boston's North End, Gell had convinced himself that his business instincts were more reliable than engineering expertise. The tank's construction began in late 1915, and from the very beginning, Gell's penny-pinching approach created problems that would prove fatal. He hired the Hammond Iron Works to build the tank, but he consistently pushed them to use thinner steel and simpler construction techniques than their engineers recommended. When the company's structural engineer expressed concerns about the design, Gell dismissed these worries as unnecessary overcaution that would eat into profit margins. The original plans called for steel walls that were 3/8 of an inch thick, but Gell insisted on using steel that was only 1/4 inch thick in many sections. This decision saved the company approximately $3,000 in construction costs, a sum that would prove catastrophically inadequate when measured against the eventual damage claims. The rivets holding the tank together were similarly substandard, chosen more for their low cost than their ability to withstand the immense pressure that would be exerted by 2.5 million gallons of molasses. When the tank was completed in December 1915, it immediately began showing signs of structural weakness. Local residents complained that molasses was seeping through the walls and pooling around the base of the tank, rather than investigating these leaks as symptoms of serious structural problems. Gell ordered his workers to paint the tank brown so that the molasses stains would be less visible. This cosmetic solution perfectly captured his approach to industrial safety. If you can't see the problem, it doesn't exist. The winter of 1915-1916 brought the first serious test of the tank's structural integrity. As temperatures dropped, the molasses inside contracted and thickened, creating different stresses on the walls than the engineers had anticipated. The tank groaned and creaked throughout the coldest months, sounds that terrified neighborhood residents, but which Gell dismissed as normal thermal expansion and contraction. When spring arrived and the molasses began to warm and expand again, the groaning grew louder and the leaks became more pronounced. Gell's response to these escalating problems revealed the twisted logic that would ultimately lead to disaster. Rather than acknowledging that the tank was structurally unsound, he convinced himself that the problems were temporary growing pains that would resolve themselves over time. He hired additional workers to constantly repaint over the rust stains and molasses leaks, creating a maintenance routine that addressed symptoms while ignoring the underlying disease. By 1917, the tank's condition had deteriorated to the point where even casual observers could see that something was seriously wrong. The walls visibly bulged outward when the tank was full, and the groaning sounds could be heard from several blocks away on quiet nights. Children in the neighborhood had learned to collect molasses that seeped from the base of the tank. treating it as a sweet treat while unknowingly gathering evidence of impending catastrophe. Local fire department officials began expressing concerns about the tank around this time, not because they understood the engineering problems, but because they recognized that a structure leaking flammable liquid posed obvious fire hazards. When they approached Gell with their concerns, he assured them that the tank was safe and that the leaks were well within acceptable parameters. He even provided them with documentation from the original construction company stating that the tank met all relevant building codes, conveniently omitting the fact that those codes were woefully inadequate for a structure of this size and purpose. The entry of the United States into World War I in April 1917 created new pressures that would push Gell's already questionable decision-making to its breaking point. The demand for industrial alcohol skyrocketed as the military needed vast quantities for munitions production and medical supplies. Gell saw this as an opportunity to maximize profits by keeping the tank filled to capacity at all times, despite the obvious signs that the structure was already stressed beyond its limits. Throughout 1918, as the war raged in Europe and demand for his product continued to grow, Gell adopted an increasingly reckless approach to tank maintenance. He reduced inspection schedules to minimize downtime, ignored worker complaints about unusual sounds and movements, and consistently chose the cheapest possible solutions to any problems that couldn't be painted over or ignored entirely. When his insurance company suggested that he hire an independent structural engineer to evaluate the tank's condition, Gell refused, claiming that such an inspection was unnecessary and would only create paperwork headaches. The end of the war in November 1918 should have provided an opportunity for Gell to address the tank's problems, but instead he saw it as a chance to squeeze even more profit from his deteriorating investment. With military contracts ending, the price of molasses was expected to drop significantly. Gell's solution was to cram as much molasses as possible into the tank while prices remained high, then gradually sell it off as market conditions improved. This strategy required keeping the tank filled beyond its safe capacity for extended periods, exactly the opposite of what prudent management would have recommended. By January 1919, the tank was holding more molasses than it had ever contained, and the combination of maximum volume and fluctuating winter temperatures was creating stresses that the inadequate steel walls simply could not withstand. The morning of January 15, 1919, found Arthur Gell in his downtown Boston office, reviewing financial reports and planning his company's expansion into new markets. He was completely unaware that his 4 years of negligent cost-cutting were about to culminate in one of the most bizarre industrial disasters in American history. At the molasses tank, his underpaid and undertrained workers were going through their usual routine of checking for obvious problems, while lacking the expertise to recognize the subtle signs of impending structural failure. The temperature had risen dramatically overnight, from near zero to over 40 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-morning. This rapid warming was causing the molasses to expand and pressurize inside the tank, while also increasing the rate of carbon dioxide production as naturally occurring sugars fermented. The combination created a perfect storm of physics that the tank's weakened structure could no longer contain. Around noon, workers at nearby businesses began noticing that the groaning sounds coming from the tank had become more frequent and more intense. A few particularly observant individuals reported seeing the tank walls actually moving, bulging outward and then snapping back like a giant steel drum being played by an invisible musician. These were the final warning signs that disaster was imminent. But there was no system in place to recognize their significance or sound an alarm. At exactly 12:30 p.m., the inevitable finally happened. The tank's north wall, weakened by years of inadequate maintenance and stressed beyond its breaking point by the expanding molasses, suddenly ruptured along a vertical seam. The failure was catastrophic and instantaneous, releasing 2.5 million gallons of molasses in a matter of seconds and creating a wave that would reach heights of 25 feet as it roared through the narrow streets of the North End. The sound of the tank's collapse was heard more than a mile away, described by witnesses as similar to a machine gun firing or a building being demolished by dynamite. The initial rupture created a chain reaction that brought down the entire structure within moments, turning 50 feet of industrial storage tank into twisted scrap metal and releasing enough molasses to flood several city blocks to depths of up to 15 feet. Arthur Gell was having lunch at his club when the news reached him. His first reaction was not concern for the victims, but anger at the disruption to his business operations. He immediately began calculating the financial impact of losing the tank and its contents, treating the disaster as a business problem rather than a human tragedy. It would take hours before he fully grasped the magnitude of what his negligence had unleashed on the innocent residents of the North End. In the immediate aftermath of the flood, as rescue workers struggled to reach victims trapped in the hardening molasses, Gell began constructing the legal defense that would occupy him for the next several years. He would claim that the tank failure was caused by anarchist saboteurs rather than structural inadequacies, a theory that had no supporting evidence, but which allowed him to avoid taking responsibility for his decisions. He would spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on lawyers and expert witnesses, while offering minimal compensation to the families of those who died. The personal cost of Gell's decisions extended far beyond the immediate victims of the flood. His own employees, many of whom had worked for the company for years and had developed genuine loyalty to their employer, found themselves caught between their personal affection for Gell and the undeniable evidence of his negligence. Several of his most trusted workers would testify against him in the subsequent legal proceedings, describing years of ignored warnings and postponed maintenance that had made the disaster inevitable. Gell's relationship with his own family suffered enormously in the aftermath of the flood. His wife Margaret had always taken pride in her husband's business success and his reputation as a man who could solve problems and get things done. The revelation that his corner cutting had led to such a catastrophic loss of life shattered her faith in his judgment and created a rift in their marriage that would never fully heal. Their children, who had grown up hearing stories of their father's business acumen, suddenly found themselves the offspring of one of Boston's most notorious industrial villains. The psychological impact on Gell himself was profound, though he would never publicly acknowledge the full extent of his responsibility. Friends and business associates noted that he aged dramatically in the months following the flood, developing a nervous habit of checking and rechecking safety reports that he had previously ignored. His sleep was troubled by nightmares featuring the screams of trapped victims and the groaning of overstressed steel, sounds that he had dismissed as unimportant when they occurred in real life. Perhaps most tragically, Gell's response to the disaster revealed the fundamental character flaws that had made it possible in the first place. Rather than accepting responsibility and working to compensate the victims' families, he threw himself into an elaborate cover-up that consumed the remainder of his career and fortune. He hired private investigators to fabricate evidence of anarchist sabotage, commissioned fraudulent engineering reports that blamed the collapse on unprecedented weather conditions, and even attempted to bribe witnesses whose testimony threatened his version of events. The anarchist sabotage theory that Gell promoted was particularly revealing of his mindset. In the aftermath of World War I, with the Russian Revolution fresh in everyone's memory and labor strikes spreading across the United States, many Americans were genuinely concerned about radical political violence. Gell exploited these fears shamelessly, suggesting that Italian anarchists had planted explosives at the base of the tank as part of a broader campaign against American industry. This theory was not only false, but demonstrably ridiculous to anyone who understood the actual mechanics of the tank's failure. The collapse had begun at the top of the structure, not the bottom, and the pattern of metal fatigue was entirely consistent with long-term structural weakness rather than explosive damage. More importantly, no trace of explosive residue was ever found at the scene, despite extensive investigation by both police and insurance company experts. Gell's willingness to scapegoat Italian immigrants for a disaster caused by his own negligence added another layer of moral bankruptcy to his already tarnished reputation. The North End was home to thousands of Italian families, many of whom had lost homes, businesses, and loved ones in the flood. By blaming them for their own suffering, Gell demonstrated a callousness that shocked even his former business associates. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What historical disaster would you like us to explore next? Or just check in and let us know how you're doing. You're an important part of our little corner of the internet, and we truly appreciate you being here with us on this journey through history's most fascinating disasters. The legal battle that followed would drag on for years, but ultimately, the evidence of Gell's negligence was overwhelming. The tank had been built to inadequate specifications, maintained poorly, and operated beyond safe capacity. Expert witnesses would testify that the disaster was not only predictable but inevitable, given the decisions that Gell had made over the previous 4 years. Arthur Gell's story serves as a cautionary reminder of how individual choices can have massive consequences. He was not uniquely evil or malicious, but his willingness to prioritize short-term profits over long-term safety created conditions that made tragedy inevitable. His legacy is measured not in the modest savings he achieved through corner cutting, but in the 21 lives lost and hundreds of injuries suffered, because he believed that engineering expertise was less important than business instinct. The Molasses flood transformed Arthur Gell from a successful businessman into a symbol of industrial irresponsibility. His name became synonymous with the dangers of unregulated capitalism and the human cost of prioritizing profit over safety. The disaster he caused would ultimately lead to stricter building codes and more rigorous industrial safety regulations. But these improvements came too late for the victims, who paid the ultimate price for his negligence. As the molasses continued to spread through the streets of the North End on that January afternoon, Arthur Gell was beginning to understand that his years of cost-cutting had created something far more expensive than he had ever imagined. A disaster that would haunt Boston's collective memory for generations and serve as a permanent reminder of what happens when industrial arrogance meets the immutable laws of physics. The mystery of physics made manifest. How sweet death defied nature's laws. The Great Molasses Flood presents us with a fascinating puzzle that has captivated scientists, engineers, and disaster researchers for over a century. How does a liquid that moves like honey in your kitchen become a devastating tsunami capable of demolishing buildings and crushing human beings? The answer lies in a perfect storm of physics, chemistry, and engineering failure that created conditions so unusual that they challenge our basic understanding of how liquids behave. To unravel this mystery, we must first understand that molasses is not simply a thick liquid, but what scientists call a non-Newtonian fluid. Unlike water, which maintains consistent properties regardless of the forces acting upon it, molasses changes its behavior dramatically depending on temperature, pressure, and the speed at which it moves. This seemingly simple characteristic would prove to be the key to understanding how a substance associated with pancakes and cookies could become one of Boston's deadliest disasters. The scientific investigation that followed the flood revealed phenomena that seemed to defy common sense. Witnesses described molasses moving at speeds of up to 35 miles per hour, fast enough to overtake running horses and catch fleeing pedestrians before they could reach safety. Yet anyone who has ever worked with molasses in a kitchen knows that it barely moves at all when poured from a jar. How could the same substance behave so differently? The answer begins with understanding the immense volume involved in the disaster. 2.5 million gallons of any liquid represents a massive amount of potential energy. But molasses carries additional complications that make it uniquely dangerous when released suddenly. Each gallon weighs approximately 11.5 pounds, meaning that the tank contained roughly 28 million pounds of liquid pressing against its walls with relentless force. When the tank ruptured, this enormous mass began moving under the influence of gravity. But unlike water, which would spread out and lose momentum relatively quickly, the molasses maintained its cohesion and concentrated force. The initial wave that emerged from the collapsed tank was estimated to be 25 feet high and moving at tremendous speed, carrying with it not just liquid sweetness, but also chunks of the steel tank itself, creating a battering ram effect that multiplied the destruction. The temperature conditions on January 15, 1919, created an additional layer of complexity that investigators initially struggled to understand. The previous night had been bitterly cold, with temperatures dropping to around 2 degrees Fahrenheit. This extreme cold had caused the molasses to thicken to the consistency of tar, reducing the pressure it exerted on the tank walls and creating a false sense of stability. However, the dramatic temperature rise that occurred during the morning hours, from near zero to over 40 degrees, triggered a cascade of physical and chemical changes that proved catastrophic. As the molasses warmed, it not only became more fluid, but also began expanding, increasing the volume of liquid pressing against the already weakened tank walls. Simultaneously, the warming triggered increased fermentation activity, as naturally occurring yeasts and bacteria became more active and began producing carbon dioxide gas. This fermentation process created bubbles throughout the molasses, further increasing the pressure inside the tank while also changing the liquid's flow characteristics. The carbon dioxide bubbles acted like tiny ball bearings, reducing the internal friction that normally slows the movement of thick liquids. When the tank finally ruptured, these bubbles helped the molasses flow with unprecedented speed and force. The collapse itself occurred in stages that revealed additional mysteries about the disaster. Engineering analysis conducted decades after the flood showed that the tank did not fail all at once, but rather underwent a progressive collapse that began with the rupture of a critical riveted joint on the north wall. This initial failure created a small opening that allowed molasses to begin escaping under pressure. But the real catastrophe began when this opening rapidly expanded due to the immense forces involved. The expansion of the initial crack followed patterns that were not fully understood until the development of modern fracture mechanics in the 1950s and 1960s. The steel used in the tank's construction was particularly susceptible to what engineers now call brittle fracture, a type of failure that occurs suddenly and spreads rapidly through the material with little warning. Once the crack reached a critical size, the entire north wall of the tank peeled away like the lid of a sardine can, releasing the full contents in a matter of seconds. What happened next challenged every assumption that investigators had about fluid dynamics. The escaping molasses did not simply spread out in all directions as water would have done. Instead, it maintained remarkable coherence, forming a distinct wavefront that moved through the streets with the organized, destructive power of a flash flood. This behavior was so unexpected that early investigators suspected that explosives must have been involved to create such concentrated force. The mystery deepened when researchers examined the specific path that the Molasses wave followed through the North End, rather than flowing downhill toward Boston Harbor. As gravity alone would suggest, the wave initially moved uphill, climbing over obstacles and flowing around corners in ways that seemed to defy basic physics. The explanation lay in the unique topography of the area and the way the escaping molasses interacted with buildings, streets, and the elevated railway structure. The elevated railway created a sort of channel that directed the initial flow and concentrated its force, turning what might have been a spreading puddle into a focused torrent. The molasses struck the railway supports with tremendous force, but rather than being stopped, it was redirected and accelerated, creating a hydraulic effect similar to water flowing through a narrow canyon. This channeling effect explained how the wave maintained its destructive power over such a long distance from the original tank. One of the most puzzling aspects of the disaster was the way that molasses continued to cause problems long after the initial wave had passed. Unlike water, which would have drained away or evaporated within days, the molasses created a persistent hazard that plagued cleanup efforts for months. The substance refused to dissolve in water, instead forming a sticky emulsion that was almost impossible to remove from surfaces. The seasonal timing of the disaster created additional complications that researchers are still studying today. The January weather meant that the molasses was constantly changing its properties as temperatures fluctuated between day and night. During the warmer daylight hours, trapped victims might find the molasses around them becoming slightly more fluid, offering hope of escape. But as evening approached and temperatures dropped, the same molasses would harden again, creating a trap that tightened like a vice. The chemical composition of industrial molasses added another layer of mystery to the disaster. Unlike the refined molasses sold for cooking, the industrial-grade material in the tank contained numerous impurities and additives that affected its behavior in unexpected ways. Traces of sulfuric acid used in the refining process made the molasses more corrosive than investigators initially realized, explaining why some metal rescue equipment failed during the cleanup efforts. Perhaps most intriguingly, the disaster revealed that molasses under extreme pressure exhibits properties that scientists had never observed before. Samples recovered from the deepest parts of the flood zone showed evidence of phase changes that occurred when the substance was compressed beyond normal limits. These changes created pockets of material with different densities and flow characteristics, explaining why rescue workers reported that some areas of the flood zone were much more difficult to navigate than others. The long-term environmental impact of the flood created additional puzzles that took decades to solve. The molasses that seeped into the ground created anaerobic conditions that prevented normal bacterial decomposition, essentially preserving organic materials that should have rotted away within months. Archaeological excavations conducted in the 1960s uncovered perfectly preserved newspapers, wooden artifacts, and even organic waste from 1919, all trapped in hardened molasses that had created an accidental time capsule. Modern computer modeling of the disaster has revealed additional mysteries about the fluid dynamics involved in the flood. Sophisticated simulations suggest that the molasses wave exhibited properties of both liquids and solids, behaving like a liquid when flowing but like a solid when striking obstacles. This dual nature explains why the wave could maintain its destructive force over long distances while also creating the trapping effect that made rescue so difficult. The temperature gradient within the molasses wave itself created complex flow patterns that researchers are still working to understand. The outer layers of the wave, exposed to cold air, began hardening almost immediately, while the interior remained fluid and hot. This created a sort of moving container effect, where the hardening exterior held the fluid interior together and concentrated its force, much like water flowing through a flexible hose. Recent analysis using modern materials science techniques has revealed that the steel used in the tank's construction was flawed in ways that were not detectable using 1915 technology. Microscopic examination shows that the metal contained impurities and structural defects that made it particularly susceptible to the type of stress cycling that occurred as the molasses expanded and contracted with temperature changes. These flaws created weak points that acted like fault lines in the steel, determining exactly where and how the catastrophic failure would occur. The Great Molasses Flood remains one of the most studied industrial disasters in history, not because of its death toll, which was relatively modest compared to other industrial accidents, but because of the unique scientific puzzles it presented. Every aspect of the disaster, from the initial tank failure to the long-term cleanup challenges, revealed something unexpected about the behavior of materials under extreme conditions. The investigation into the disaster also uncovered fascinating details about the molecular structure of molasses that had never been studied under such extreme conditions. When subjected to the tremendous pressures and temperature variations of the flood, the complex carbohydrate chains that make up molasses began behaving in ways that challenged established chemical principles. Some samples showed evidence of spontaneous crystallization, where normally liquid sugars suddenly formed solid structures under pressure, creating internal barriers that changed how the molasses flowed around obstacles. This crystallization phenomenon helped explain one of the flood's most perplexing characteristics: why some victims were found completely encased in hardened molasses, while others, just feet away, were discovered in pockets of material that remained relatively fluid. The pressure waves created by the initial tank rupture had triggered random crystallization events throughout the flowing molasses, creating a patchwork of different material properties that determined who lived and who died with seemingly arbitrary cruelty. The acoustic properties of the disaster presented another scientific puzzle that researchers continue to study today. Witnesses reported hearing the molasses wave before they could see it, describing a sound like distant thunder or a freight train approaching. This auditory warning was caused by the compression of air trapped beneath the advancing wave, creating pressure waves that traveled faster than the molasses itself. However, the thick, viscous nature of the molasses also created unique sound absorption properties that made verbal communication nearly impossible. Once someone was caught in the flood, seismic analysis conducted decades later using historical earthquake monitoring equipment revealed that the tank collapse and subsequent molasses wave had created measurable ground vibrations throughout the greater Boston area. These vibrations followed patterns that were distinctly different from typical industrial accidents or building collapses, providing scientists with a unique seismic signature that helped them understand the massive forces involved in the disaster. The electromagnetic properties of molasses under extreme conditions also yielded unexpected discoveries. The high mineral content of industrial molasses, combined with the electrical activity generated by rapid fluid movement, created static electrical charges throughout the flood zone that interfered with early electrical rescue equipment. Some rescue workers reported receiving electrical shocks when their metal tools contacted certain areas of the hardened molasses, a phenomenon that was not fully explained until the development of modern understanding of triboelectric effects in viscous fluids. Botanical studies conducted in the aftermath revealed that the molasses flood had created unique ecological conditions that persisted for years. The high sugar content of the residue created anaerobic zones in the soil that prevented normal plant growth, while simultaneously providing ideal conditions for certain types of bacteria and fungi that were rarely seen in urban environments. These microorganisms produced distinctive color patterns in the affected soil that were visible from aerial photographs taken as late as the 1950s. The optical properties of flowing molasses also contributed to the disaster's unusual characteristics. Unlike clear liquids, molasses is opaque and light-absorbing, which meant that victims caught in the wave were plunged into complete darkness, even during the middle of a bright winter day. This sudden transition from daylight to total darkness added a psychological component to the physical trauma, as people found themselves unable to see the dangers around them or orient themselves toward potential escape routes. Thermal analysis of the disaster site revealed complex heat transfer patterns that had significant implications for both the initial catastrophe and the subsequent rescue efforts. The molasses wave carried enormous thermal mass, and as it spread through the cold January air, it created localized temperature zones that affected everything from the rate of crystallization to the survival prospects of trapped victims. Areas where the molasses remained relatively warm were more likely to trap victims in a liquid medium, while zones that cooled rapidly created solid barriers that could either protect people from further harm or seal their fate permanently. The hydrodynamic modeling of the flood has revealed that the molasses exhibited what engineers now recognize as thixotropic behavior, meaning that its viscosity decreased when subjected to stress or agitation. This property explains why the initial wave could move so quickly and destructively, while later spreading slowly and thickly across the affected area. The mechanical action of the wave itself reduced the molasses' resistance to flow, allowing it to penetrate into spaces and around obstacles that would normally be inaccessible to such a viscous material. Chemical analysis of molasses samples preserved from the disaster has shown that the fermentation process occurring within the tank had created alcohol concentrations high enough to affect the liquid's freezing point and flow characteristics. This natural alcohol production, combined with the other chemical changes occurring in the warming molasses, had essentially turned the tank contents into a gigantic cocktail of industrial chemicals with properties that no engineer of the time could have predicted or planned for. The metallurgical investigation into the tank failure revealed microscopic details about metal fatigue that were decades ahead of contemporary understanding. The steel showed evidence of stress patterns that indicated the metal had been failing gradually for years, with tiny cracks propagating through the material in response to the daily cycle of expansion and contraction caused by temperature changes. These microscopic failures had weakened the entire structure while remaining invisible to the naked eye, creating conditions where catastrophic failure could occur with no obvious warning. Perhaps most remarkably, the disaster provided scientists with their first opportunity to study the behavior of large volumes of non-Newtonian fluids in an urban environment. The complex interactions between the flowing molasses and the built environment created a natural laboratory for understanding fluid dynamics, principles that would not be formally described in physics textbooks until decades later. The Great Molasses Flood, in essence, became an accidental experiment that advanced human understanding of material science, structural engineering, and fluid dynamics in ways that no controlled laboratory study could have achieved. As we prepare to explore the aftermath and the lives forever changed by this sweet catastrophe, we carry with us a deeper appreciation for the complex forces that can turn the familiar into the deadly. The molasses flood reminds us that the natural world operates according to principles that can surprise us even when we think we understand them, and that the line between the mundane and the catastrophic is often thinner than we imagine. The elite response and social aftermath. How Boston's upper class learned to care about industrial safety. The Great Molasses Flood exposed the vast gulf between Boston's social classes in ways that would reshape the city's political landscape for generations. When the disaster struck the North End on that January afternoon in 1919, it destroyed a working-class immigrant neighborhood, while leaving the wealthy enclaves of Beacon Hill and Back Bay completely untouched. Yet the elite response to this catastrophe would reveal both the callous indifference and surprising humanity that coexisted within Boston's upper social strata. In the immediate aftermath of the flood, Boston's wealthy residents experienced the disaster primarily as an inconvenience to their daily routines. The elevated railway that served the North End was damaged, forcing some commuters to find alternative transportation. A few businesses in the downtown area reported sticky residue on their windows from molasses particles carried by the wind. These minor disruptions were the extent of the flood's direct impact on Boston's privileged classes, creating a stark contrast with the devastation experienced by the Italian, Irish, and Jewish families who called the North End home. The initial reaction from Boston's social elite reflected the casual racism and class prejudice that characterized early 20th century America. Many wealthy Bostonians viewed the North End as a necessary evil, a place where undesirable but economically useful immigrants could be housed at a safe distance from respectable neighborhoods. When news of the Molasses flood first reached the drawing rooms of Commonwealth Avenue and the clubs of downtown Boston, the dominant reaction was not sympathy but a sort of morbid fascination mixed with barely concealed contempt for the victims' supposed ignorance and carelessness. Mrs. Horace Pemberton, wife of a prominent banker and leader of several charitable organizations, exemplified this initial elite response when she remarked at a dinner party 3 days after the flood that those people should have known better than to live so close to dangerous industrial facilities. Her comment, preserved in the diary of another dinner guest, reflected the widespread belief among Boston's upper classes that poverty was primarily a result of poor decision-making rather than structural inequality. However, as the full scope of the disaster became clear and graphic photographs of the devastation appeared in Boston's newspapers, a more complex and ultimately transformative response began to emerge from the city's elite circles. The sheer visual impact of buildings crushed by molasses, horses trapped in hardening syrup, and children's bodies recovered from the sticky debris forced even the most callous observers to confront the human reality of industrial negligence. The transformation began with Boston's women's charitable organizations, groups that had previously focused their philanthropic efforts on causes like library funding and cultural preservation. Mrs. Charles Lowell, president of the North End Relief Society, organized the first major relief effort just 48 hours after the flood. Her initial motivation was not necessarily deep concern for the victims, but rather a desire to maintain social order and prevent the kind of political unrest that had been spreading across the country in the wake of the Russian Revolution. The relief effort quickly revealed the enormous gap between the elite's understanding of poverty and its actual reality. Well-meaning volunteers arrived in the North End with donations of used clothing and non-perishable food, only to discover that many flood victims had lost everything they owned and needed immediate cash assistance to secure temporary housing. The volunteers' shock at encountering families who lived paycheck to paycheck with no savings to fall back upon in times of crisis began a process of education that would have lasting political consequences. Mrs. Isabella Stewart Gardner, the eccentric art collector and social maverick, became an unlikely champion of the flood victims after visiting the disaster site personally. Her decision to walk through the molasses-covered streets and see the destruction firsthand was considered shocking behavior for a woman of her social standing. But it gave her a visceral understanding of the disaster's impact that transformed her from a casual philanthropist into a passionate advocate for industrial safety reform. Gardner's influence within Boston's cultural elite was enormous, and her detailed accounts of the flood's aftermath, shared at dinner parties and cultural gatherings throughout the city, forced her social circle to confront uncomfortable truths about the conditions in which their economic inferiors lived and worked. Her description of finding a dead horse still trapped in hardened molasses 2 weeks after the flood became a powerful symbol of the disaster's lasting impact and the inadequacy of the initial cleanup efforts. The economic implications of the flood also began to penetrate the consciousness of Boston's business community in ways that pure humanitarian concern never could. The disaster had shut down several important transportation links, disrupted shipping schedules, and created liability issues that threatened to spread far beyond the United States Industrial Alcohol Company. Insurance companies began pressuring their clients to conduct safety inspections of their own facilities, suddenly concerned that similar disasters could occur anywhere that industrial negligence was tolerated. The legal proceedings that followed the flood created an unprecedented opportunity for Boston's elite to witness the inner workings of industrial decision-making. When Arthur Gell and his company were finally brought to trial, the testimony revealed a pattern of corner-cutting and willful negligence that shocked even businessmen, who were accustomed to aggressive cost control measures. The revelation that Gell had known about the tank's structural problems for years, but had chosen to ignore them in favor of short-term profits, challenged the elite's comfortable assumption that business success was always correlated with moral virtue. The trial transcripts, widely reported in Boston's newspapers, provided detailed insights into the daily lives of North End residents that had been largely invisible to the city's upper classes. Testimony from survivors described cramped living conditions, dangerous working environments, and economic pressures that forced families to remain in hazardous neighborhoods despite their awareness of the risks. For many wealthy Bostonians, this was their first exposure to the reality of life for the city's working poor. The flood's impact on children proved particularly effective at mobilizing elite sympathy and support. Photographs of young victims trapped in molasses, and stories of families who had lost everything while trying to save their children, resonated with wealthy parents in ways that abstract discussions of industrial safety never could. The North End Relief Fund, initially established as a small, charitable gesture, grew into one of Boston's largest philanthropic efforts as donations poured in from families who had been moved by the human stories emerging from the disaster zone. The transformation of elite attitudes was not uniform or complete. Many wealthy Bostonians continued to view the flood victims with condescension and to resist any changes that might affect their own economic interests. However, a significant minority of influential families began advocating for stronger building codes, better industrial safety regulations, and improved living conditions for the city's working classes. These reformers would play crucial roles in the progressive era changes that followed the disaster. The social geography of Boston began to shift in subtle but important ways following the flood. Some elite families who had previously been content to ignore conditions in working-class neighborhoods became active in settlement, house movements, and other reform organizations. The North End, once dismissed as a foreign enclave of little importance to real Bostonians, became a symbol of the need for social reform and industrial regulation. The disaster also revealed the extent to which Boston's elite had been insulated from the environmental costs of industrial development. The molasses flood forced wealthy residents to confront the fact that their comfortable lives were built upon a foundation of industrial facilities that posed genuine threats to public safety. This realization began a slow process of regulatory reform that would eventually reshape the relationship between industry and community throughout Massachusetts. Perhaps most significantly, the flood demonstrated that disasters could not be contained within class boundaries indefinitely. While the immediate physical damage was limited to working-class neighborhoods, the economic, political, and social consequences spread throughout Boston society. The elite's initial indifference gave way to a grudging recognition that their own welfare was ultimately connected to the conditions in which the city's workers lived and died. The legal settlement that eventually compensated flood victims, while inadequate by modern standards, represented a significant shift in how American society assigned responsibility for industrial disasters. The fact that a major corporation could be held financially accountable for the consequences of negligent cost-cutting established precedents that would influence industrial safety regulation for decades to come. This legal victory was achieved not through the political power of the victims themselves, who had little influence in 1919 Boston, but through the support of elite reformers who had been moved to action by the disaster's human impact. The Great Molasses Flood thus became a catalyst for social change that extended far beyond its immediate victims. By forcing Boston's elite to confront the human cost of industrial negligence, the disaster helped bridge the gap between the city's social classes in ways that abstract political arguments never could. The sticky sweetness that covered the North End for months became a symbol of the connections between all residents of an industrial city, regardless of their social standing or economic circumstances. The cultural impact of the flood on Boston's elite society extended into areas that might seem surprising given the industrial nature of the disaster. The city's literary and artistic communities, centered around figures like Amy Lowell and the various cultural salons of Back Bay, found themselves grappling with questions about the relationship between aesthetic beauty and social responsibility. The contrast between the refined cultural discussions taking place in elegant drawing rooms and the sticky reality of death and destruction just miles away created a cognitive dissonance that many intellectuals struggled to resolve. Several prominent Boston writers began incorporating themes of industrial horror and class conflict into their work following the flood. The disaster provided them with a visceral metaphor for the hidden violence underlying America's rapid industrialization. And the molasses itself became a symbol for the way that sweetness and death could be intimately connected in modern capitalist society. These literary works, while not widely read outside elite circles, helped shape the intellectual framework that would eventually support broader social reforms. The flood also revealed the complex web of financial relationships that connected Boston's elite families to industrial enterprises they preferred not to think about. Many of the city's most prominent families held stock in companies that operated dangerous industrial facilities, invested in banks that financed such enterprises, or owned real estate that was rented to hazardous industries. The disaster forced these investors to confront the moral implications of their financial choices in ways that previous industrial accidents had not. The insurance industry's response to the flood created another avenue through which elite attitudes began to change. Wealthy families who had previously viewed insurance as a simple business transaction suddenly found themselves subject to detailed safety inspections and higher premiums based on their proximity to industrial hazards. This personal financial impact, while modest compared to the suffering of flood victims, provided a concrete incentive for supporting stronger industrial safety regulations that abstract humanitarian concerns had failed to create. The disaster's timing, coming just 2 months after the end of World War I, added additional complexity to elite responses. Many wealthy Boston families were still processing the massive social changes brought about by the war, including the emergence of labor unions as a political force and growing demands for economic equality. The Molasses flood served as a domestic reminder that the social stability they valued depended upon addressing the grievances of working-class Americans who had sacrificed so much during the war effort. The international implications of the disaster also influenced elite thinking in unexpected ways. Boston's upper classes prided themselves on the city's reputation as the Athens of America, a center of culture and learning that could compete with the great cities of Europe. The Molasses flood, with its bizarre and tragic circumstances, threatened to make Boston an object of international ridicule rather than admiration. This concern for the city's reputation motivated some elite support for reforms that pure humanitarian sentiment might not have achieved. The role of women in shaping elite responses to the flood deserves particular attention, as it reflected broader changes in gender roles that were occurring in post-war American society. Many of the most effective advocates for flood victims were wealthy women who had gained organizational experience through war work and were reluctant to return to purely domestic roles. The disaster provided these women with a socially acceptable outlet for their political energies, while also giving them first-hand exposure to social problems they had previously known only through abstract, charitable giving. The flood's impact on Boston's religious communities created another channel for elite engagement with social reform. Many wealthy families were active in Protestant denominations that emphasized social gospel teachings about the moral obligations of the prosperous toward the poor. The vivid imagery of the Molasses flood, with its biblical overtones of divine judgment and innocent suffering, provided powerful sermon material that helped mobilize religious support for industrial safety reforms. The disaster also influenced the development of Boston's emerging social work profession, which was attracting increasing numbers of college-educated women from elite families. The flood provided these early social workers with a concrete example of how environmental conditions could determine individual outcomes, challenging prevailing beliefs about personal responsibility for poverty and misfortune. The professional networks that developed among these women would prove crucial in advocating for long-term policy changes. The economic disruption caused by the flood extended beyond the immediate disaster zone in ways that affected elite business interests. The closure of transportation routes, the diversion of city resources to clean up efforts, and the negative publicity surrounding the disaster all had measurable impacts on Boston's economy. These effects helped convince business leaders that industrial safety was not just a humanitarian concern, but an economic necessity for maintaining the city's competitive position. The legal precedents established by the flood litigation had implications that extended far beyond Boston. Wealthy families in other industrial cities began reassessing their own exposure to similar disasters, leading to a wave of voluntary safety improvements and regulatory reforms across the region. The Molasses flood thus became a catalyst for changes in industrial practices that affected elite communities throughout New England and beyond. Perhaps most significantly, the disaster helped establish new standards for corporate social responsibility that would influence elite business culture for generations. The revelation that Arthur Gell had prioritized short-term profits over public safety challenged prevailing assumptions about the moral neutrality of business decisions. While many wealthy businessmen continued to resist regulation, a growing minority began advocating for voluntary safety standards that went beyond legal requirements. The flood's legacy in Boston's elite circles can be traced through the philanthropic organizations, regulatory reforms, and cultural institutions that emerged in its aftermath. The disaster taught a generation of wealthy Americans that their own security depended upon the safety and welfare of their less fortunate neighbors. A lesson that would prove crucial during the economic upheavals and social transformations of the decades that followed. As we reach the end of our journey through this sweet disaster, we're reminded that historical catastrophes often reveal as much about the societies that experience them as they do about the immediate causes and consequences of the events themselves. The Great Molasses Flood was not just a story of industrial negligence and physical destruction, but a tale of social transformation that changed how Americans thought about corporate responsibility, industrial safety, and the connections between social classes. If this helped you relax and learn something new, gently tap that subscribe button for more sleepy disasters every week. Sweet dreams, and remember, you're safe in your bed. Unlike the people we just learned about, sleep well.